I have the great pleasure of welcoming our fourth keynote to the conference. Dr. Tania Croix is a senior lecturer of sociology, youth and childhood from King's College London. Tania's background is in professional youth, community and play work. Her research focuses on youth services and how policy with professional and voluntary services interacts with young people's lives. Personally, I'm delighted that Tania agreed to be with us here at the conference. Within community youth work here at Ulster, we draw really heavily upon Tania's teachings in our classes because of the critical approach she takes to youth work, the value she places in open access youth work, and her caution over where and with whom youth work and youth workers align themselves. Her concerns and alternatives to measurement are another reason why she's a firm favourite with us at Community Youth Work at Ulster. And the fact that she's not afraid to mention heart work, magic and storytelling as legitimate and necessary part of what we do as youth workers. We're delighted to welcome Tania, Youth Work as Hard Work in Turbulent Times.
Thank you. It takes 20 minutes to walk from my home in Hastings, a seaside town in southeast England, to the youth club where I volunteer as a youth worker on a Friday night. 20 minutes at hurrying pace, and I'm nearly always late. Half jogging down steep alleyways, bowling past the corner shop, crossing at the lights, round by the primary school, then up, and out at the top. On Broom Grove Estate, the roads are named for wealthy rural uplands, Malvern, Chiltern, Quantock, Mendip, reflecting the idealism of 60s social housing, irony unintended. There are views of channel and countryside, and sometimes you can smell the sea, but this isn't England's pleasant land. The greens are strewn with litter from black bin bags ravaged by gulls and foxes, contents left to scatter in the wind. So it becomes normal, rustling through rubbish on the way to the precinct. There used to be a pub here, but now you meet your neighbours at the cost cutter with its huge selection of strange, useful items, its 16 surveillance cameras and full-length perspex screens at the counter. There's a laundrette and a friendly pharmacy. And last but not least, not KFC, but HFC, Hastings Fried Chicken, the only hot food around if your mum's working late when you get home from school or the credits run out on your prepayment meter. Hastings, where I live, is the poorest town in southeast England, and the youth club, open only 1 hour per week, is in its most disadvantaged neighbourhood. It's hard to talk about such places without echoing the sneer of Daily Mail articles, Britain's worst estates. I intend the opposite, of course, but it's easy to get it wrong, especially as an outsider. Even though I don't feel entirely outside, I'm not from here, but I grew up and lived as a young person and a young adult in low-rise hillside estates like this one, out of town, out of sight, out of mind, where writing seemed unlikely to change anything, and initiatives mostly made things worse. So we stay out of the limelight. If we must be left behind, then at least leave us alone. I'll step away from Broom Grove for a moment to just say a bit more about what I'm hoping to do in this talk and why I started where I did. How's the sound? It feels a bit echoey from here. Is it all right? Cool. It's hard to find the words to say what an awful year this has been. I'm looking back now on more than 30 years as a youth worker, the last 15 also getting into research and academia, and nearly 50 years of life on this planet. And I've only ever lived in turbulent times characterised by capitalism, its consistent, deliberate, systematic devastation of life. But this year has felt particularly bleak. We cannot talk or write of young people without thinking of the young people living impossible lives in Gaza, in Sudan, in the many places ravaged by the legacies of racial capitalism and oppressive systems of domination. In these times, we have no business doing business as usual. I don't know how it is for you, but at times this turbulence, it stops my thinking. Other times turbulence seeps in, whether invited or not. Liberatory movements have taught us that the political always interacts with the personal, the structural with the everyday. For me, my personal has sometimes been all about taking action, At other times, I've been floored by depression, anxiety, despair. And everything's related, of course, mental health shaped by the social and political context we live in, a context of genocide, violence, ecocide, racial capitalism, transphobia, patriarchy, ableism, the continuing growth of the far right that we're seeing at the moment. And partly shaped, of course, by our childhood experiences, for many of us by growing up in poverty in families and communities that were heavily under-resourced. My research and this talk don't directly focus on this devastating global context, nor on personal experiences of mental health. But when I was writing this talk, it didn't feel possible to bracket any of this off either. And one of my kind of provisional or current ways of not bracketing off what feels irresolvable, painful, unthinkable has been to re-engage with more creative forms of writing, bringing together the emotional and the political, the personal and the professional. Writing for myself outside of work, fiction, poems, personal essay. Don't worry, I'm not going to share a poem. But with no publication strategy, no Harvard referencing, no regard to the research excellence framework. Writing outside of work, and yet, of course, the politics always seeps in, and so does youth work. And of course, there's a long tradition of creativity and narrative writing within and related to academic writing. Crucially, these come from communities that have been the most harmed by dominant forms of knowledge production. It's not that I see creative and reflective writing as a sufficient response to political events. Personally, political engagement sometimes inspires me to write, but often it stops my writing in its tracks. This has been true since I was young. As a child, I loved creative writing, but in becoming political as a teenager, writing increasingly felt irrelevant. I grew up under Margaret Thatcher, England's architect of neoliberalism and accelerated environmental destruction. I was inspired by the miners' strike and poll tax riots I saw on TV, and I started seeing injustice everywhere. At school, in my family, on the hill where I walked my dog, where a big road was going to be built through our community. I didn't go to university. I didn't want to go. Writing and studying felt indulgent, irrelevant. So when I left school, I threw myself into anarchist and environmental activism, and I was looking for work, but it was a time of high youth unemployment. I couldn't find work in the cleaning jobs and the shop work that my mum was doing, let alone anything else. So I started volunteering, and that's how I ended up as a play worker and a youth worker. At that time, I believed we needed action, not words. And as an aside, I'm quite grateful there's hardly any evidence of my zealous activist past, because I was a bit embarrassing. But there is a short clip online. You won't be able to find it because it's not got my name. But I'm 19 and I'm storming a climate conference desk, and this guy is talking, and he's probably quite a nice guy, I don't know. But anyway, I'm storming up and I rip his paper and I'm saying, when I'm your age, there won't be a world for us to save, and we've had enough of your words and we need action. And I realise the irony now that my work is about words rather than action. I did fall back in love with writing through studying as a mature student. I am grateful and very surprised at the unexpected turn my life took, and that I get to write and teach as part of my job, much as I find academia sort of offensive, horrendous and impossible. So in the context of the turbulent times that were referenced in the conference blurb, and acknowledging the limits of writing and research, rather than offering a traditional research structured presentation, I wanted to include some excerpts of my sort of personal reflective writing, even if it doesn't quite fit, as well as sharing some research data as well, which I will do in the second half. And I resonate with Maggie Nelson's words that most of my writing, or speaking in this case, usually feels like a bad idea, but I hope some of the themes and ideas connect with some of you. So in this first half of the talk, I'm reflecting on youth work as heart work. And in the second half, I'll share some data from my recent research with Louise Doherty on youth work's value and evaluation. So before going further, I know there are many youth workers and youth work writers in this room, but I also know youth work is not a term that's familiar to everyone, and I want to take a minute to explain how I understand it. Youth work is a form of informal education in which youth workers and young people create spaces together where they can spend time, learn informally through conversation, relationships and activities. And I'm specifically interested in what we increasingly call open youth work. We love this term, open, because it's about youth work that as a practice encourages young people to get involved on a voluntary basis. It's their choice rather than being referred or targeted or compelled to take part. The openness is also about being open and youth-centred in terms of timescale, how long you take part, whether you want to come or not, content and what happens, and also outcome. It's not got a pre-specified outcome. It's whatever young people bring and want to do. Usually it takes place in purpose-built youth clubs, increasingly more shared spaces, community centres and so on, or outdoors in neighbourhoods, on the streets and in parks. The young people who take part are usually teenagers, but it varies. There's often a lot of flexibility. There's often quite a wide age range, although not as wide as Maysoon's presentation, where 50-year-olds were counted as young people. In England, it's usually 13 to 19 or 13 to 25. It does vary a bit in different countries. Youth work can be a profession. There are professionally accredited university degrees and training, such as the Community Youth Work BSc here at Ulster. In some countries, there isn't such a thing as kind of a youth work qualification, but it might be part of social work, or it can be volunteer-led or youth-led. I first heard the word heart work that I've used in the title of this talk from a collaborator and friend, Milka Fisiha, who's a youth and equity professional a couple of years ago. I'd not heard this specific term, heart work, before, or not in relation to youth work. I had been interested for a long time in love and emotions in youth work, and I wrote about love and passion for youth work as part of my PhD more than 10 years ago, thinking about the ideas of emotional labour, Ali Hochschild, and the work of Sarah Ahmed and Eve Sedgwick. My PhD explored how part-time youth workers experience their work in a changing policy context. And those youth workers were doing most of the face-to-face work with young people, while also being the most junior, often in very precarious positions. And the research took place just after the election in 2010 of the right-wing coalition government in the UK. It was based mainly in England, and I have to say that the effects have been different in the different nations of the UK. But in 10 years in England, youth work was cut by 70%. So I expected to hear a lot from the youth workers about the problems in the work at the time, and I did. People spoke of the effects of those cuts, but also other things that had gone on for much longer: targets, bureaucracy, privatisation, insensitive management, deficit views of young people, and so on. But when I asked youth workers, what do you like and not like about your work, they nearly always started with the word love. And so I wrote about love and passion in youth work. And I also want to mention Martin Purcell's work. He might be here somewhere, and I know he's doing something, here he is, doing something tomorrow on professional love in youth work, which is really great work as well. I'm returning to these ideas of love, I guess, in a slightly different way at the moment, thinking with the heart, thinking that heart can refer to love and passion, but also more broadly to our emotional centre, and hearts can also break. So after 15 years of austerity and ongoing racial capitalism in the non-profit industrial complex, what does it mean to focus on the heart in youth work? Here, I want to think about youth work and perhaps youth research in conversation with Gargi Bhattacharya's We, the Heartbroken. This is a beautiful book about the necessity of moving towards the collective in relation to grief in the context of racial capitalism. And I'll read this quotation. We're broken-hearted not only because of loss, but also because of knowledge. Not only because life ends, but also because life disappoints. And most of all, not only because into each life some rain must fall, but also because the deluge washing away the possibilities of human life sweeps down generations, reducing us all. Heartbrokenness is a way, quote, to capture the sorrow that moves between individual grief and all that's so broken in the world. It's a necessary and unavoidable aspect of politics, and it operates partially by making us unknowable to each other, but also contains the potential for collective action coming together. So I'm wondering, what if we foreground or centre the heart in our understandings of work with young people? if we think about what is heartfelt, heartbreaking, and heartful, perhaps. Not that that's a better way necessarily to understand youth work, but because heartbreak and grief, which are not always the same thing, both figure in youth work. I'm not planning on sharing a lot of heartbreaking stories. As Gagi Bhattacharya writes, we need to be careful of wearing personal grief as a badge of honour. And the point really is how normal it is. But briefly and without much detail, I want to remember a young person I knew when I was a street-based youth worker. He didn't used to talk much, but he smiled a lot, hated school, but was valued as a friend. And he had a really loving family. He joined in with everything we did as youth workers, discussions, social action, weekends away. He was great in team challenges, getting over walls and all those kinds of things. We were working in an area of so-called gang activity and he'd been sent to prison. Within days of being released, he was tragically killed. I think he was 15. And I remember going to tell my manager, who was a really experienced, fantastic youth worker, a manager who'd grown up and lived in a similar nearby area. He was a really supportive and empowering person, so maybe I'd expected advice or sympathy, and maybe I got them. What I remember is how he looked at me hard, and the words I recall him saying were, "I have been to more funerals than I can count." I took these words to mean something like, if you're going to do this work, get used to it. And I wonder if it was also something like, do not ask me, a black man who grew up here, to look after you, get your support elsewhere. And if that's what he was saying, that's fair. I didn't grow up in that city and one day I would leave. Even though I had experienced plenty of what they now call adverse childhood experiences in my own childhood and youth, as a white young woman, my visible heartbreak wasn't the risk it would have been for him. Probably, like my tears for Gaza now, seems somehow beside the point or out of place, the luxury of the outsider, a distraction from what needs to be done. I don't know, but I do know I didn't do the work of finding support elsewhere. Nothing was set up for it. I'm not sure things are much better now for all the talk of trauma-informed practice. And for many youth workers, it happens again and again. Perhaps some of us here, whether through our work or personal and family circumstances or political lives, as well as tragedies as the risks to those we work with, both in their everyday lives and when they're with us. We've seen some awful tragedies recently. I remember another time during a youth work session when two masked men came into the room where I was working with some young people, and they threatened me with what they said was a gun in a carrier bag. I don't know if it was. They'd seen me collecting money for a trip we were going to be going on the next week. Luckily, they left for whatever reason. We just carried on. We just got on with the session. I don't think we reported it or mentioned it again. And there is a certain expectation and even celebration of normalising these things in youth work, of kind of bravado, I suppose, and sometimes it's a good coping strategy to normalise it, to cry and laugh maybe, but primarily keep going. But I'm not sure where it leaves us. Gagi Bhattacharya says, when we try to tidy up, squash down or split off our heartbreak from all the other heartbreaks, we endanger our sense that this cannot go on. In the youth work world, there's another prominent focus of our heartbreak, and that's the loss of youth work itself. And I've written about this recently with my colleague Louise Doherty in an article that will come out soon in Journal of Education Policy, where we draw on theories of social haunting, Avery Gordon's work, and some youth studies scholars here in the UK as well. We can't equate these disparate forms of heartbreak and mourning, and we need to be mindful, as I've indicated, of our positionality. But I want to think together about possible directions for heartful thinking as part of politically engaged practice in working with young people, whether as youth workers or youth researchers, about what is loved about youth work that can be defended and reignited, but what we also might need to engage with our hearts to change. And I'll talk about some of this shortly. But I wanted to bookend this first half of the talk by returning to the housing estate, where I'm volunteering as a youth worker, to feel by walking, to think about our everyday emotional entanglements of space and place, how we experience these in our present and in our past as children and young people, to consider how our engagement with young people might relate to our own biographies and memories, our feelings, emotions, and the places and spaces where we live, love, and work. Walking through the estate, there's an atmosphere of abandonment, far from the tourists in the old town. 2 miles to beach, town centre or hospital, which is an hour's walk with the steep hills. Not easy with kids, impairments or illness. People muddle through with old cars, shared lifts, taxis and the occasional expensive bus. Safe from gentrification, but not from its costs. The welfare state feels shaky here and probably always has. The estate was built on land known as Tin Town for its makeshift steel houses, cold in winter, hot in summer, that had themselves sprung up around a large complex of workhouses. This was an industrial area dominated by a large power station. It's dismantled now, leaving land contaminated after 30,000 scrap tyres caught fire, a profit-making opportunity for developers. When the estate was built in the 1960s, there was still a place at the top of the hill for tying donkeys. Families moved in before it was finished, construction delayed by unstable slopes and unexpected watercourses. Decades later, it still feels unfinished. Damp and mould, dereliction, playgrounds with missing equipment. If something's broken, it stays broken. The natural reseeding landscape sign is unconvincing. These lawns were never prioritised for municipal mowing, even before the rewilding fashion. There's a protective thing the body does in places where troubles and traumas are concentrated, left to simmer and mingle. A tautness of the skin, shallow breathing, keeping wits about you. You get used to it, and the tightness sometimes feels like safety. You might join in with the loudness and laughter. You might feel it as a threat. Either way, there's pride in surviving and living, satisfaction in storming off uphill from family arguments, walking the dog in anger, the normality and shame of growing up in listening distance of other people's feuds and fallouts, knowing that everyone can hear your own. As a child or teenager, you use what you have. The skate ramp is run down and no one here skates. But if you throw your body fast enough down one side, the momentum helps you pull yourself up the other, or hang out underneath when it's raining, or when you need the privacy that a partial shelter can bring when you're 15 and you share a bedroom and you've fallen out with everyone at home. You can play manhunt on the slopes and stairwells, and there's a den high up in a scrap of woodland. On light evenings, I like to take the deeply rutted path where there are sparrows chirping, a stream rushing by, and brambles grow higher than my head. The children who use this path themselves tell me the water's full of rubbish and pollution and worn of needles, paedophiles and drug dealers. Here, we youth workers, usually a fairly streetwise bunch, are rendered naive, protected by infants. I wanted to include in this talk some elements I was sort of uncertain of, so including something of myself, some slightly different writing, some embodied and less conscious understandings and engagements with youth work and young people's lives and the spaces and places where they live. Turbulent thinking for turbulent times, perhaps. Moving on now to the second half of the talk and continuing to think heartfully about youth work, I wanted to move focus to what young people love about the work as well as what we might need to change. And I've organised this next half of the talk around the themes of spaces, stories and struggle. I'll be weaving in some data from a 3-year study I did with Louise Doherty, so I'll just briefly mention that. It was called Rethinking Impact Evaluation and Accountability in Youth Work, and aimed to understand the perspectives and experiences of young people, practitioners, managers, policymakers, funders on both the value of youth work and how it was evaluated. So it's qualitative research. We engaged in participant observation in 8 varied youth work organisations in different areas of England and undertook lots of interviews, focus groups and participatory youth research. And to situate this discussion in young people's perspectives and voices, I'd like to share just a minute clip from a 10-minute film that was made by young people as part of the study with an organisation called Mouth That Roars. The young people did all the filming. They decided what it was going to be about, they engaged with some of the research data, but then they could do whatever they wanted. It didn't need to relate to the research directly. The young people were from 3 organisations in 3 different regions of England, London, North East and the South West. And yeah, I'll play a minute of that.
I come to youth club because it helps more with my social life and my mental health.
It's more fun than being at home a lot of the time.
I'd probably sat at home right now watching my phone and just be laid in my bed, which is not good for you.
If this wasn't here, it would probably be like quite boring. Yeah, there's not much to do.
It teaches you new things a lot every day. I've made loads of new friends in all of here.
Hang out with my friends and I can
just get away from screens.
Because it gives me a place to go and I really can't deal with being anywhere else. It's special to meet people, just to know that you can be friends with everyone without being judged.
If it didn't for me, I'd just be sat at home, bored, in the house, doing nothing, and probably getting in trouble.
It's helped me get through a rough stage in my life where I've been really sad, and just coming here makes me, feel free.
So I'll leave that there, but I've put the QR code if anyone, or I can share the link. Oh, okay, sorry. That's the one. I think there's something really striking about the way young people talked about youth work, and they decided what they wanted to emphasise, not just in how much they value their youth clubs and youth workers, but also the kind of reasons they give. They're not speaking of youth work as something that kind of keeps them off the streets. They all have different reasons. It's nothing to do with employability or whatever the government's funding at the moment, or exam grades or anything that could be measured as an outcome. They value youth clubs for reasons that are intrinsic and life-affirming, and in some ways very simple. Although youth work takes place in a really diverse range of locations and places, there's a common and distinctive spatiality to youth work spaces. And it's not so much the buildings that are important, although they can be. What's fundamental to young people is how it feels, the relationality, who's there, its informality. Just a quote from a young person in the research, it's quite freeing in a way, because you know that there's always someone to talk to about things that you might not want to broach with your parents and friends and something, and you know that you've got a place to go that's just sort of completely separate from everyday life. So if you're having a bad day, you know you can sort of leave it all behind. Just a 2-hour break from just anything that's bothering you, and it makes you feel free about things. This word free again, which also came up in the film and came up in many focus groups and interviews. As an anarchist, I'm liking the word free being used here. And the emphasis on youth work as part of everyday life, but also separate from everyday life, I think is an interesting area to think about. In an article for Children's Geographies, Louise and I wrote about youth work as third place. We were drawing on Ray Oldenburg's ideas of the home as first place, and the work or school and college for young people perhaps as second place. And then the idea that we need third places where we can be together, speak with each other, just kind of hang out without the pressures of commercialism or sort of outcomes we're meant to achieve from being there. Resonating as well with the writing of others in that area. Youth work can provide a welcoming space that is young people's by right, and this is in contrast to hostile and exclusionary public spaces and schooling that are classist, racist, gendered, homophobic, transphobic and ableist. And I want to shout out to Trans Kids Deserve Better, which is a group that people might know has been camping outside the Department for Education in London over 7 days. They occupied the front of that building to demand their rights. Hardly reported at all. Yet youth work spaces exist in the context of the outside of this problematic outside world. So, for example, one of the youth clubs where we did research was located on a housing estate and a block of flats, and it brought the predominantly black members of that youth club into conflict with the police. So Jasmine, a very young person who was very committed to that youth centre, said, "We get police reports every day, then the police come and intimidate young people. It just makes it uncomfortable for young people to come. If police are here every day, I'm not coming. I don't need the grief, I can just go somewhere else. Fuck that." Youth work cannot erase oppressive wider environments simply by being there. It also needs to engage young people and youth workers in reflection and potentially action on inequalities and on changing their worlds. But youth work's increasingly grounded in neoliberal logics of self-improvement, and this change has been going on for much longer. And entrenched in the neoliberal state. And Maysoon Sukareya, who spoke yesterday, and CYR&D, who's also here and presented yesterday, have written on these important things. And this neoliberalism in youth work is enabled and incentivised by dominant approaches to impact measurement, which requires these kind of standardised programmes where young people's outcomes are expressed as social return on investment. I'm not going to talk at length about this study and about impact measurement and evaluation. It is my pet topic if anyone wants to grab me later or another time, but I'm also aware some people here have kind of heard me ramble on about that before. So just to say briefly that increasingly larger government programmes and some smaller charitable contracts and grants come with requirements to prove outcomes, often using standardised, validated tools from psychology that are completely inappropriate in a youth work setting. Young people and youth workers found them really problematic. And just one quotation, Luna saying, "Some days you don't really want to think about that question and it can make you think too far into it. And then you can be left thinking about it for the rest of the day. Sometimes the things that it says on those questionnaires can actually give you ideas instead of helping you." So instead of that, I would celebrate traditions of youth work evaluation rooted in a critical evaluation of practice. And our chair, Gail Neal, has written with Debs Owen, who might be here somewhere as well, about that on Critical Voice Northern Ireland in a really lovely blog piece. Young people and youth workers repeatedly told us that evaluation in youth work should be reflective, should be about stories, experiences and creative expression, not numbers, spreadsheets and paperwork. And I'm particularly interested in youth workers' stories, and I'll mention a few examples shortly. But of course, we do need to also reflect critically on stories, especially if they're sort of reused or reframed for evaluation. So just a few critical questions about stories. Youth workers ask the question, are they going to count? If we write these stories or tell these stories, do they even get counted by funders? And there is this perception that's quite right, really, among that funders will prefer quantitative indicators. Certain powerful funders do require specific measures, and this is particularly advanced and perpetuated in the international development field, and then it's kind of reinvented in really quite small grassroots organisations asking for funding for like really, general youth work, but then they suddenly have to sort of remake this youth work as if it's something completely different. We spoke to policymakers in our research, and even policymakers and funders thought this was really problematic. But there is this preference for quantitative data and the idea that there's the randomised control trials are the gold standard. So youth workers understandably feel we could put all this effort into telling stories and they won't be taken seriously. We're going to need to still prove it using numbers. And I think this goes along then with a real lack of confidence amongst many of us as youth workers in both numbers and stories. So youth workers and young people, of course, have often had really negative experiences of schooling. A high number of youth workers have dyslexia, just as an example. Evaluation and impact measurement is a class issue, it's a race issue, it's an ableism issue. But I think this means it's all the more important to hear stories from groups, from youth workers and from young people who are too often marginalised from knowledge production. And I suppose in that work, it's some of the things that some of us have been thinking about are encouraging youth workers and young people to tell stories, but how can we do that in ways that avoid that sort of dominant genre of either deficit narratives, saviour complexes, the tropes of victim and rescuer? There's also the question of whose story is it to tell, supporting youth workers to tell young people's stories. Can that ever be right? And also, even if we reframe it as youth workers telling their own stories of practice, how much of our own kind of possibly heartbroken stories do we feel ready to share and for what purpose? Nevertheless, I do want to mention a few projects that I've been really grateful to be involved in alongside other researchers and youth workers. Because I think despite these challenges, there are powerful arguments to support youth workers and young people to tell youth work stories. I just had the pleasure in being in a coffee and conversation session run by Critical Voice Northern Ireland, discussing youth work. And I think it was Liz McArdle who said, if we don't write about our knowledge, no one else will write it. Oh, someone else, that's the problem. Someone else will write about it for us. And I think this is true. So the things I wanted to mention are a project that happened more than a decade ago now. This is Youth Work Stories from Practice. And this was an organisation called In Defence of Youth Work that a few of us in this room were part of, a grassroots campaign that formed in 2009 to challenge the neoliberal direction of youth work. So defend youth services against the cuts, but also against the targeted frameworks and these kinds of things. And Bernard Davies led an initiative that some of us here were involved in to gather stories of practice. The whole point of it was that the stories would represent the diverse impact of youth work in all its complexity, not a kind of fake linear story, but something a bit more nuanced. The book was printed by youth work trade unions and distributed to policymakers and decision makers. Don't know if it affected policy in any way, but what it did do is led to hundreds of conversations and workshops with youth workers, which were, I think, really valuable. Another example of kind of different forms of writing by youth workers. Janet Batsleer led a project called Youth Work in Times of COVID-19, and it was linked to the Mass Observation Project, which some people might know about in Sussex University. And here, some of those of us, the collective of us involved in this, we invited youth workers to write a diary every month, and it was a diary from when we got up in the morning till when we went to bed that day, and it was just one day a month. And I think doing that diary, many of us felt kind of liberated from that idea of telling a story of a young person's story through youth work. It was a different kind of writing, and we got some really different kind of styles of writing. I think we all felt we developed our writing as we went through it. And thirdly, I wanted to mention some current work with Maki Hiratsuka, who leads really collaborative project with youth workers and researchers in Japan. Some of us are trying to sort of mirror it here in the UK and work collaboratively together to write stories of practice for the purposes of critical reflection on practice, and also sort of communicating what youth work is to people who might not know what it is. So I'm coming to my final theme. Inevitably, I'm running out of time, and I always do this. And I think what I always seem to do, and I don't know if anyone else resonates with this, is leave resistance, struggle, and hope to the end when I'm already kind of speaking too fast. And I wonder if it's some kind of subconscious fear of hope, of thinking differently in a world where struggle and hope are kind of hard to think and hard to imagine. And yet we struggle, we hope. In our Rethinking Impact study, youth workers and young people were really outspoken in stating their support for youth work to be supported in policy. So we asked them what they'd say to policymakers. And for example, Joel, a volunteer, said, "Get from behind your desk and computer screen and come and look at it yourself. Then you'll realise that actually youth work has a massive impact on the lives of young people." And Isaac, a young person, summed it up: "Stop cutting our bloody funding, thank you." And while this kind of critique of policy was really commonly expressed in interviews and focus groups, it was less clear whether young people and youth workers felt they had any agency to affect change, whether over youth provision itself or wider social issues. And there's a kind of tension here as well, because often those of us who love youth work, we find ourselves celebrating and defending youth work, while also knowing that youth work has its problems, that we're engaged in struggle within youth work itself. That's not about the behavioural modification model. That's not about the creation of the neoliberal self. So youth work and in defence of youth work's wording, that is volatile and voluntary, creative and collective, and association and conversation without guarantees. Bianca Baldridge in the States writes really powerfully about this youth work paradox, that youth work can mean potential sites of liberation, but also sites of containment and fixing, and that they're not really two separate practices, they're often very intertwined. So do we as youth workers feel equipped to struggle for and defend youth work that is liberatory, while also being critical of youth work that's fixing, saving or controlling? How do we manage that tension? So I did want to mention a few inspiring practices of struggle and practices of heart work, really. And here I want to pay tribute to Sue Atkins, who some of us here know, who was a comrade and friend in defence of youth work, a lifelong youth worker who died this year at the age of 86. And she used to really speak up for open youth work as transformative and critical, the value of that everyday open youth work, creating spaces with young people at their heart. And she used to talk about the three sisters of resistance, rebellion and revolution at the heart of youth work. Sometimes we joked that we were maybe being a bit romanticised to think this was the case, but let's try and claim it. I want to do a real shout out to the amazing Black working class led radical youth work organisations that are so inspiring at the moment, that are challenging systemic racist policies and institutional practices. And it's these organisations, I feel like Voices That Shake, Forefront, Kids of Colour, Advocacy Academy, Healing Justice London, maybe people want to mention other examples, who overtly challenge the state, at risk to their funding, no doubt. Forefront saying the only system we have to deal with conflict and harm in society is itself a source of conflict and harm. I also want to shout out to Aida Youth Centre in Bethlehem in Palestine, just to highlight really that there's areas of the world, of course, where being a youth worker threatens your life and threatens your liberty. The executive director of Aida Youth Centre, Anas Abu Surur, has just been released in August after spending 9 months under unjust administrative detention in Israeli prison. Administrative detention meaning there's not even a charge brought. You're just locked up for 9 months. And I want to also mention critical and radical work by support and research organisations such as YouthRex in Ontario in Canada, led by the amazing Uzo Anucha. So there are amazing things going on, and I'm now coming to the finish. We're living in times that are not only turbulent, but also horrific, certainly heartbreaking. These are times when to think, write, talk, work, whether as a youth worker or researcher or anything else, can sometimes feel futile, contradictory, impossible. And in this context, huge thanks to the organiser of this conference. I think we really need these spaces where we can be together, engage in dialogue, feel inspired, maybe feel a bit hopeful. And in this talk, I've suggested that youth work can be understood as a personal, professional and political form of heart work, and asked what happens if we foreground what is heartfelt, heartbreaking and heartful in our work. Youth work's a form of informal education in which youth workers and young people create spaces for conversation, relationship and activities, for being, becoming and belonging. These spaces are severely lacking just when they're really needed. So to finish with some questions, can youth work reclaim a critical anti-oppressive stance at its heart? Are youth workers supported enough in their heart work, in all its complexity in the context of their own lives and histories, spaces and struggles? Is youth work equipped to defend itself against attacks on its informal youth-centred nature and liberatory purpose? And I'll finish with a couple of questions for youth research. What can youth research learn from youth work? And what are some of our approaches collectively to researching and writing in turbulent times? Thank you for listening.